In this video, we're going to be taking a look at continuing activity 414, modeling mechanical motion, and we're going to be looking at our spur gear mechanism that we're going to add in. So let's go ahead and get started with what we're going to be creating. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a 1x8 beam from our VexIQ parts. So I do have them uploaded in my folder as noted from the previous my previous one. Now the one thing I need to do, you'll notice I tried to insert into current design and it says I need to save the design before. So I always need to, anytime I'm creating an assembly, I need to do that. So I'm going to call this the spur gear assembly and I'm going to hit save. Now when I right click and insert into the current design, I can bring up my parts. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this 90 degrees. And I'm going to go up here to my browser and I'm going to ground this part by right clicking on the name in the browser and choosing ground. And I'm going to throw in a couple of other components. So we're going to be looking at a 2-inch shaft we can insert into the design. And I'll go ahead and put this in. This one is going to be roughly about the second hole in from the left. So I'll go ahead and set this one in there. I'm going to use the move copy tool. Choose the end. I'm going to create a copy by checking that in the dialog box and then dragging, and then now you'll see the copy get created. So this one here ends up being about the fourth one in. So this one ends up being right about here, and that's what I'm kind of looking at from the picture. And then what we're going to see is we're going to add in a 12-tooth gear into this as well. I'm going to rotate and kind of bring this up by 90 degrees. And then we also need a 60-tooth gear, which is part of our IQ parts, the VexIQ parts that we have available. And I'm going to kind of move this off to the side so that way it doesn't get in the way. Okay, I'm going to collapse my data panel for this particular case. And what we're going to take a look at with the spur gear is the same kind of scenarios what we did with our pulley system. I'm going to use the joint option. I'm going to end up choosing a revolute joint, and I'm going to choose the end of my shaft, and I'm going to choose the outside edge of the hole in which it goes into. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a Z offset of 1 inch, so that way it kind of splits the difference. It's not exactly the same amount on each side, but it's pretty close, just given with the selections we have on this part and with what we're working with. Again, you know, we're not really having to be too concerned. I'm going to do the same thing with here and here on this part as well, and offsetting that as well. Again, as long as we're keeping consistent offset values, and the same thing with our gears that we're working with, that's the main thing in this activity. Okay, I'm going to take a look at joint. I'm going to change to rigid, and on our gear, I'm going to highlight, and very similar to how we did on our pulley, I'm going to highlight over the face there, hold the control key, and I want to choose the center of that square opening that we have there, and then I'm going to choose the very center on my part. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to offset that by a negative 0.75, and let's see what kind of room we have. I think that looks pretty good. And we're going to go ahead and say OK. And I'm going to do the same thing on this larger 60-tooth gear. Again, I'm going to zoom in here on the face, zoom in, select the center of the hole, and then go over here to my shaft, choose the center. Offset of a negative 0.75, and I can say OK. So what you're going to notice here is as I look at the front, our gears are going to be very close to have interlocking teeth. And the one thing that they want us to take a look at is we want to make sure that these teeth are kind of lined up so that way they don't interfere with each other. So right now, this is not exactly the best case scenario for what I'm looking at. So I can do that by checking and by editing so you'll notice you got a little flag here for your joints. So I'm going to go ahead and you can select the flag, right click, choose edit joint. Now that's for the revolute. So there's a few different ways that you can go through and kind of, like to me, I like to go through and kind of click, and you know, I can kind of move these around by just clicking and dragging. So I want to kind of move these very small increments Make sure they're not touching. You can kind of zoom in there and see what that looks like. When you're zoomed out, they still look like they may be touching, but that's okay. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to capture the position, so that way that stays like that. And as I capture the position for it, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same kind of thing as I take a look at motion and doing a motion link between those. So I'm going to go ahead and assemble, motion link. I'm going to select my revolute constraints or joints, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to see that here are my joints here. Now, one thing that we may take a look at is looking at our particular gear ratios. So here we have a 12-tooth gear and we have a 60-tooth gear. So again, we look at our ratio between those two. That's a 5-to-1 ratio. So that means this gear should be turning 5 times compared to 1 revolution on this larger gear. So if I take a look at revolute 1, that's the smaller gear. We'll keep that at 360 degrees. If we take 360 divided by 5, we're going to get that should be 72 degrees. So now you'll see that this gear is turning a lot slower. I'm going to say OK. Now, as if I go up to the joints and I right click and I say Animate Model, you're going to be able to see here that, but they're turning in the same direction. So you see that's why they're getting interfering teeth. So with my motion link, I'm going to right click on it and say Edit Feature. And I'm going to select the reverse option and then say OK. Now let's take a look at animating the model. Now when you look, now we're getting a more realistic motion, and there's where our teeth are not intersecting, and now we're seeing that motion being created from those two components. So this will finish up the spur gear mechanism as you take a look, and you know, as far as animating the model, that's how we can go through and get that done and see what kind of motion we get from those particular components. Take a look at the next video and we'll start looking at the worm gear mechanism for that.